The Harlem Renaissance.
During the early 20th century, conditions were unkind for the Southern African Americans. Jim Crow laws, poor racial attitudes, and low economic opportunities for African Americans persisted in the Dixie. The North, in contrast, held a very attractive image for many. Industrial jobs in the North flourished due to World War I production, and people were generally more liberal. As such, a huge migration of 1.6 million African Americans to northern cities occurred in the 1920s. In New York City, housing tensions resulted in thousands of blacks flooding urban areas, creating mini cities such as that in Harlem where African Americans could live in communities together. This was partially spurred by a desire for familiarity reminiscent of the pressures of foreignness depicted in Dracula. The collection of all these people led to the Harlem Renaissance, an integration of Southern culture and the so-called Black experience, with the North resulting in a huge boom in creativity and urban culture.
Literature during the Harlem Renaissance was centered around African American culture and its close relationship to civil rights and reform organizations. One of the literary movements during this time period was modernism, a trend that overturned traditional modes of representation and to express new sensibilities of their time. Writers of this time pursued more experimental and highly individualistic forms of writing such as Dreams by Langston Hughes, which analyzes the discrimination and struggles that African Americans face, contrasting with the dreams and aspirations that blacks maintained despite the brutal world of racism. Ghosts by Andrew Bennett relates to the Harlem Renaissance as it describes ghostliness and haunt of identity in literary texts and the questioning of the nature and terms of stories. For instance, in The Beloved, the novel refers to the unspeakable reality of slavery and the atrocities of its past, a central theme of the Harlem Renaissance. With the racism hauntings of the time period, The Beloved utilizes ghosts to disturb our sense of human and the dead. Similarly, the Harlem Renaissance literature experiments with abstractness, diving into the stream of consciousness and rejecting realism.
The musical boom of the Harlem Renaissance can be attributed to the popularization of jazz music. Jazz presented musicians with a blank canvas, allowing them to improvise and create rhythms that became irresistible to the youth of the time, becoming a metaphor for the new, looser ideals of the 1920s. We can observe similarities between the new ideals of the Harlem Renaissance and the social revolution of the New Woman, of the late Victorian era. In 1925, Ellen Locke, a professor of philosophy at Howard University, published an essay arguing that African Americans should reject their historical image as former slaves and instead pursue their new cultural values. Locke's ideas thus push for cultural equality and unification between black and white Americans. The New Woman movement, on the other hand, advocated for social and intellectual equality for men and women. Society, however, always seems to fear change. Both movements were seen as corruptions of traditional ideas, which would taint the minds of younger individuals. Lucy in Dracula is the epitome of a traditional Victorian woman until she is bit. She then becomes a hellish being. Through Dracula, the new woman is thus portrayed as demonic, abandoning all traditional roles of women and instead serving to corrupt the future generations. Many label jazz music with the same demonic connotation. Jazz, referred to as the devil's music, sprouted a culture that promoted freedom, dancing, and interracial interactions, all aspects that were frowned upon by older generations.
During the Harlem Renaissance, an explosion of art was produced in Harlem, New York. Art was one of the driving components of this movement, and works from this time are some of the most renowned in world history. Two of the most acclaimed artists from this era were Aaron Douglas and Augusta Savage. Douglas's influence was so great that he was given the title the father of Black American art. His art portrays his personal life experiences as a black man in America and illustrates what he felt were some of the most important aspects of African American culture. He was a leader in the Harlem Renaissance, and he, along with his wife Alta Sawyer, were known to have opened the doors of their home to other hugely impactful individuals who led the movement, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes. Savage was called to become an activist through her own experiences with racism and severe discrimination. Her most recognizable work includes portrait sculptures of Harlem Renaissance leaders W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, as well as her sculpture called The Heart. Many of the works of the Harlem Renaissance in all different mediums were influenced by religion, especially Christianity, which was a driving inspiration behind many artists' work during this time period. What parallels do you see between the Harlem Renaissance and American culture today? In Arno Bontep's poem, Southern Mansion, she frequently refers to ghosts. However, the context implies a much deeper meaning behind these ghosts than simply the concept of a stereotypical ghost. What do you think she is trying to represent with the specific diction in Southern Mansion? How do you think music from the Harlem Renaissance has either directly or indirectly impacted your experience with music today?